A very good evening, everybody, and welcome to Kaizen Central, brought to you, as always, by Manufacturing TV. It's a warm summer's night, and I'm very grateful to you for taking time out to join us in this conversation. I've been looking forward to this session with enormous anticipation. Ewan Lloyd Baker recommended I get hold of a book called Tragedy and Challenge, written by Tom Brown, who's our guest tonight. And I have to say, it was one of the most extraordinary reads in a long term. I suspect not because it told me anything new in principle, but it did tell me that put an awful lot of personal experiences and flesh on the bones of the argument that we have all come to understand as being the political moves, the moves in the City of London that have somehow, over the last few decades, since perhaps the 70s, contributed not only towards a decline in British engineering and manufacturing, but has also contributed to a sense of alienation among the general population about what engineering and manufacturing actually do and what they contribute to our economy. Now, the goal of this session is not necessarily to go over old stories and old battles, because what we're all about, as you know, is about looking at ways in which we can improve the visibility of manufacturing in government and in the general population. And that's very much our mission, and that's what we do. But there was one quote in the book that demonstrates that attitudes to manufacturing that have been changing over the years are not necessarily the preserve of one particular political party, although I'll let Tom speak to this himself in a minute. The Thatcher years really were the sort of sea change, but the fact that other political parties got infected is a hard word, but I'll use it anyway. Tom was talking to Ed Balls, who was chief advisor, first secretary of the Treasury or something like that at the time during the Labour government, and he asked Ed Balls for his view on the decline of engineering and manufacturing. And Ed Balls said, "You might as well mourn for the dinosaurs." And Tom, I suspect you were more than taken aback to hear that from Mr. Balls at the time you were having that conversation.
Well, I found that kind of thing very demotivating when he made that comment. I think probably people who were more cussed and thicker skinned than me were just getting on with running their businesses and not meeting people like that, and probably weren't so influenced. But I think it was very demotivating. It put a lot of young people off joining manufacturing careers. I think as you were saying, attitudes have changed, and nowadays politicians would all pay lip service to the importance of manufacturing, but actually most of them don't understand where to begin in actually creating an environment that helps manufacturing.
Yes, I mean, I think the key thing that I took from your book, particularly what you were saying around what Margaret Thatcher, and as I say, that sort of that sharp push on the tiller that moved our economy and our society in a different direction. The positive note I took from that was that if politics can shape society and industry's place in it, pardon me, in one direction, then it should be able to push it in a different direction as well. And that, of course, is what we all hope for. That's what we're all fighting for, if you like. I'm wondering if you share that optimism.
I certainly share the logic. And if you look at countries like, say, Germany over the last 70 years, look at China more recently, then their governments have certainly done that. I don't actually have much optimism that the UK government is about to go in that direction, although logically, as you say, it could.
Tom, I've sort of rather jumped straight into the conversation. I suspect it would be helpful for those members who haven't had a chance to read the book if you could just give us a quick thumbnail portrait of your time in engineering and manufacturing. A thumbnail is a bit much to ask because it's a very comprehensive career, but if you wouldn't mind just offering just a little bit of an insight.
Well, I joined GKN as a graduate trainee. The first management job was as a shift manager in Scotland in a very tough drop forge, 2 weeks days, 2 weeks nights, 750 men and 3 nurses to mop up the wounded. I got sponsorship from GKN to go off to IMD Business School in Lausanne, very generous of GKN. Had a wonderful year there doing an MBA. And not long after that, I was really lucky to get offered the chance to be managing director of a GKN outfit in South Tyrol. And actually, that South Tyrol these days is part of Italy legally, but culturally it's still part of Austria. It was part of Austria until the Treaty of Versailles. That was a wonderful experience. It taught me how the Germans run engineering companies. I'd seen in Scotland how badly companies like that one was run, and I could now see a much better way of running them. I came back to the UK, had a brief spell consulting with McKinsey, which was very interesting, and I learned a lot, but consulting really wasn't my style of things. Went back to GKN and ran Vandervelde, the engine bearing company for them. But I found GKN terribly frustrating. It was dominated by accountants. And so I was very lucky to be headhunted to go and run an engineering group called B. Elliott and became chief exec of that, only to find that the city simply wasn't interested in the sort of German long-term approach that I wanted to develop. They wanted takeover deals and big dividends and quick paybacks. I moved on from that to Fenner, company that a number of you probably know, FTSE 250 business, which was unfortunately taken over by Michelin a couple of years ago. And then from there to a company called United Industries. And again, I had an endless trouble with city shareholders, that they didn't want the sort of approach that I was trying to do. So I ended up moving up from that into a non-executive career and was involved in a wide range of different companies. I was in total on the board of 7 stock market quoted companies. I did some private equity ones, one family business, a government quango, really quite a wide range of things. And it gave me a lot of insights into what was going on and going wrong in the British manufacturing environment.
Well, Tom, and by the way, everybody, as per always, please just use the raise hand thing or stick your hand up if you want to make a contribution or ask a question of Tom. But I just want to dig a little deeper into your approach as a human being, Tom, to business and to your career in engineering. You talked about the battlefield that was that drop forge in Scotland in the 70s and how awful it was, and they had to have nurses because health and safety was clearly not at a premium. You use the word caring a great deal in your book when it comes to talking about colleagues and people who worked for you. You talk about teams, you talk about openness, you talk about honesty. These are values clearly that you regard very highly. Yes,
indeed. Well, it's interesting that you highlight them like that. Yes, absolutely. I've always seen business not just as an opportunity to make money for oneself, but to do a much wider social good. And one of the things I greatly regret over the time I've been working is it's changed so much in the UK. It used to be a situation where people had a wide regard to stakeholders of all kinds, employees, local communities, and so on, as well as shareholders. And I think one of the problems is that, certainly for quoted companies, fiduciary duty has come to be interpreted as simply meaning maximum returns to shareholders as quickly as possible, regardless of what that does to other stakeholders. And of course, private equity has absolutely no degree of caring or anything like that at all.
If I may, I think that's very much a thing that happened. I think it was 1970. Was it Milton Friedman wrote that article in New York Magazine saying that companies that didn't look after shareholders were, in effect, as you say, they were abrogating their fiduciary duty, and that sort of pulled the trigger on on a race to short-termism, quarterly returns, stock price pumping, and that was America, but it came over here, particularly after 1986. And Mr. Friedman has a lot to answer for. John Hardwick, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks, Tom, for being here this evening. It's very interesting to hear your perspective on things. I suppose the question that immediately triggered in my mind, and it shows my ignorance about the way the capital markets work outside of the UK, but I'd be interested in your insights as to why it's not such an issue in Germany. You know, how is the capital structure in Germany different to that in the UK that means they don't suffer this short-termism that we see in the capital markets in the UK?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, first of all, relative to the size of the economy, far fewer German companies are stock market quoted. The German dynamo has been the Mittelstand of unquoted family-owned businesses who simply don't have these pressures and problems. That the family can do what they want. They finance the business out of retained earnings. They don't have outside shareholders. They're their own masters. The German quoted sector is really quite small. If you look at the total value of the German stock market, it's a lot less than the UK, although the German economy is a lot bigger. Now, I think in many ways, they're in a more old-fashioned place. And the companies like Siemens, which is an excellent German engineering group, I think you'd find simply doesn't suffer from the sort of pressures that, say, a GKN did, which led to GKN's takeover by Melrose. If you went back to, I don't know, the 1960s, 1970s, GKN wouldn't have suffered like that. That GKN would have been treated with respect by analysts rather than seen as a football to kick around. And I think the Germans, in many ways, are just at a more old-fashioned place like that. I don't think there's actually anything in terms of legislation or structure that keeps it that way. It's much more a matter of attitude and social beliefs.
If I can pick up on that quickly, Tom, just to, there was the point you make in the book, which is that British historically have been poor at business, and yet obviously very good at financial trading and so on. Is that at the root of it, do you think? The Germans have always been better at business and taken far less note of things like financial trading?
I think the Germans have been, well, certainly during the last 50, 70 years, they have been a lot better at manufacturing than we have. I'm not sure they've been better at retailing. Banking, I think potentially they've been a lot worse than we have. So I think it differs a lot by sector. I think one of the big problems comes back to the inherent class structure in the UK, and that we've tended to regard manufacturing as a demeaning sort of job. The typical the British hierarchy says that the so-called professions like law and medicine and that kind of thing, academia, are the prestige places to go. If you're not going to go into that kind of thing, then you should do something like accountancy or that type of clean-handed thing. And that manufacturing is way down at the bottom of the status order. And even within manufacturing, the thing that people shun away from is the manufacturing process itself. They'd rather be a salesperson in a manufacturing company or something. So that actually the business of manufacturing is often, or historically has often been run by people who aren't particularly able or well qualified, whereas in Germany, it's very different from that.
John Hardwick, I'm sorry, Ewan, before I come back to you. John, I think I cut across you. Were you wanting to ask a follow-up, or what was I?
No, I was just thanking Tom for his answer. No, that's fine.
Super, thank you. Ewan Lloyd-Baker, good evening.
Yes, good evening, and hello there, Tom. Tom, I'm just interested to understand the sort of the motivation behind the book. Was it something that you wrote for sort of almost for cathartic purposes, or were you hoping that it would, maybe a snowball that would start a sort of some momentum in order to actually drive some change? Maybe there are two questions in there, and if having published the book, what was the response, and has it made any difference as such? Has people been sort of ringing you or contacting you on the back of it from either a political perspective or an economic perspective or even a financial perspective and saying, we love what, we wholeheartedly agree with it and the content of it, let's say, who weren't in the manufacturing sector, and actually what a great blueprint that we ought to try and incorporate into a strategy going forward. So, sorry, two questions. One, the motivation for writing it, and then secondly, having written it, sort of whether you've seen any sort of positive outcome.
Okay, very interesting. Well, first of all, the motivation, it was both the things you mentioned. I felt a scream building up inside me that I just wanted to have the chance to say what I really believed was right, because I'd sat through so many board meetings where I felt that you couldn't say what I believed was right, particularly regarding things like fiduciary duty and that kind of stuff. But also, I did hope that it was going to make some change and that there would be some impact from it. In terms of a response, well, very varied is the answer. If you look at people who are involved in manufacturing, it's tended to resonate very strongly. I've had some wonderful letters from people who've, people I've never met, don't have a clue who they are, but they've written through my publishers to me letters about it and so on. If you look on Amazon, you look at the reviews which are there, a lot of them are posted by people who are obviously working in real jobs in manufacturing and heartfelt comments. And I'm very, very gratified by that. If you look at the political environment, however, which is really the government environment, is where we most need to initiate change, in my view. It's very different. I sent the book to about 40 MPs of different parties. There wasn't a single Conservative who took any interest in it at all. 3 Labour politicians took some interest. Rachel Reeves, who is now the Shadow Chancellor. I met her a couple of times, and she took a bit of interest in the book, but I don't think she ever seriously took it on board. I would have loved to have been able to help her. She was chair at the time of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee. And her background was as a Bank of England economist. She had no experience in any of those fields, but she wasn't interested in playing that game. Hilary Benn was another one. Had a very good letter from him, but again, he didn't want to take it further. Jack Dromey, I don't know if any of you know him, the MP for Erdington in Birmingham, married to Harriet Harman, who's rather better known than he is, but he was Shadow Work and Pension Secretary at the time. And we actually worked on a joint article about the problems of the influence hedge funds have in takeovers. But we couldn't find anybody to publish it, despite the Labour Party's press office pull. So the only party that really showed much interest was the Lib Dems. And I got invited to join the Economic Policy Committee, chaired by Vince Cable at the time. And that did some good work, I think, and produced a document which contained a number of the recommendations in my book. And then, blow me, but when they came to the last election, the manifesto basically didn't contain any of that stuff. And Joe Swinson conducted the most unsuccessful campaign, which more or less saw the Lib Dems wiped out. And that was the end of that initiative. So the answer is it's resonated strongly with people like, I guess, the guys on the call tonight. But unfortunately, not where it really matters in terms of Whitehall.
You did get quite a bit of press coverage. Oh, sorry, Ewan, we'd like to follow up. Yeah.
Yeah, would you mind? Just, I'm interested because do you think now that because, let's say, through a process of almost elimination, i.e., it was the Lib Dems that gave you an audience, so to speak. Do you think now one of the challenges is that, let's say, you and therefore the book has therefore been tainted by being linked to a political party, or do you think, I mean, the message in the book I think is irrelevant of your politics. It's what we should be doing, full stop. Particularly, the summary of the key recommendations, I think, are a fantastic sort of, 10-point plan or however many points there are as going forward. But do you think one of the challenges now is that in order to try and, because we're, part of Kaizen Central is about, and UK Manufacturing Unite is how do we create a voice and how do we build up momentum? Do you think part of your challenge now is that you are politically tainted, if you don't mind me using that expression?
I don't think so, because I don't think anybody apart from people on this call and a few others know that I was actually involved in the Lib Dems, because they never publicised that committee. I've not been a member of any political party in the last 30, 40 years. So no, I don't think that's the case at all. I think if we had a different government, then potentially there's stuff there that people would pick up and run with. But I don't imagine the present Tory government is going to run with much of it, particularly a lot of the city angles, which means clamping down on their rich donor pals.
I was going to raise, Tom, the fact that you did get some interesting press coverage from people like David Smith and the Sunday Times and so on at the time. And if anybody wants to look at those, do go to the Amazon page. Or in fact, are the press cuttings on the Amazon page or on your publisher's page? The Troubadour.
It's on a note I sent you separately.
Right. Okay. I'm just wondering, because you say my profession shares a certain amount of the blame for a lot of what's happened, in the sense that they become cheerleaders for the M&A game, and very few, if any, journalists, none that I can think of, have actually, at a mainstream level, supported manufacturing, and I guess that is rather indicative of the way media works, and the way people seem to parrot whatever is the flavor du jour, and what the power structures dictate.
Yeah, I was very pleased with the amount of press coverage that the book received, actually. Your comment is obviously inevitably true, that something like a takeover battle is far more exciting for journalists and readers than some Mittelstand company reporting that its sales grew by 5% last year, and that it's taken on another 30 graduate engineers. But no, I don't feel the media has been a major problem in this, although it could have been better. I think that the root cause of the problem has been poor government. Or poor successive governments.
Yes, I just talking about media, Tom. When you and I were, younger, let's put it that way, there was a very vital role that was played in all newsrooms, that of the industrial editor. But what a misnomer that was. Those correspondents had nothing to do with industry and everything to do with strife and trade unionism. And the moment that the Conservatives won their battles with the trade unions, lo and behold, industrial editors fell by the wayside and got transformed into business correspondents. And there we go. And just a quick anecdote, when I was at LBC in the 80s, pre-86, pre-Big Bang, there was one business reporter in the newsroom. By 1990, there was a whole cohort of them, because city news became sexy, industrial news became boring. Beverly Nielsen, good evening to you. You've got your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Tom. Really fascinating to hear you talk about your past career. And as a West Midlander, I'm delighted to hear that you've spent quite a bit of time at GKN. And I, like you, can say that I know Jack Dromey really well, and he's been tremendously supportive, as indeed do I know Vince Cable. So I was very sorry to hear about the outcome of all your policy dialogue with the Lib Dems. But thanks for sort of your overview. But in your, and I'm afraid I haven't read your book yet, but in the summary, it talks about the sort of potential negative impact of Brexit. And I just wondered if you'd like to say a few words about how you feel Brexit is going for manufacturing at this point.
That is obviously a crucial question. I mean, first of all, we got a deal. And at the time I was writing my book, it was quite possible there would have been no deal at all, which I think would have been pretty catastrophic for a lot of the companies I knew. One of the companies I was chairing towards the end of my career had about 65% of its sales in the Eurozone. And if we'd had tariffs, that would have been, well, probably receivership for that company, I would think. So at least we got that. I think other people on the call who are still working in industry will know better than I do exactly how it's working out in terms of things like the testing regimes and so on, the paperwork that's involved. But I feel the game isn't fully played yet. That one of my concerns is that potentially we're going to get divergence between UK legislation and European legislation on things like standards and so on, so that companies that want to export again have to meet two sets of criteria. That hasn't happened yet, but could happen easily over a period of time. And I guess another thing that concerns me is the Northern Ireland situation is clearly far from resolved. Now that probably doesn't immediately affect too many engineering companies. It affects more food companies and people like that. But if Johnson goes down the route he's talking about unilaterally ratting on the deal he signed, but effectively, then the EU is likely to react. And if they were to react in something like, let's say, threatening to put tariffs on cars, that would be draconian. And I think that at the moment that game just isn't played through. And I hope very much that we can avoid conflict. I hope both sides are sensible enough. I think the European side is, but I think Johnson is showing every signs of trying to renege on a deal that he only signed a few months ago, and that's not going to work well.
Can I come in just with a quick supplementary, if that's okay, Nick?
Yeah,
just to ask you if you could give any insights and thoughts in following on from your point there, and particularly any deviation in standards in terms of what that might mean for the next generation of cars. We're looking at electric vehicles, of course, and battery production and so forth. Do you see any advantages for the UK in its current position in terms of next generation production, particularly in automotive?
It's frankly very difficult to say. Nissan is committed to building a battery factory in the UK, which is a very positive step. Quite what bribery the government has given to get them to do that is unclear. Nissan, of course, is the UK's biggest car manufacturer. It's also it's probably the weakest of the big international car groups. And one battery factory in the UK doesn't make us a battery force. I believe I read somewhere there's something like 30 battery factories in Europe already. So we're playing catch up rather than anything else. And I think there's still a long way to play on that. I think there's a positive aspect of Brexit that has come out is an encouragement to more UK sourcing. That one of the problems that the UK car manufacturers have to face is having a sufficiently high UK content. Typically the Japanese have worked with a pretty small UK content, and in some cases they're going to have to increase that, and that could give the opportunity for some UK supply companies to expand. I don't know. I mean, frankly, if you take a 20-year view on it, I'm not particularly optimistic.
Well, there you go. That's rather sobering thought. I mean, obviously there is a hope. I think that, as you say, that supply chains will adjust themselves. We had Tony Haig of PP Control and Automation on a few weeks ago, and we were discussing the make or buy debate, whether we make here or buy in, and how Brexit / COVID have altered that. So I think supply chains are very definitely changing. Perhaps this plays into a point you made when you were at BBI in the South Tyrol, Tom. An experience you had that really demonstrated to you that customer service for the long haul, not just as a matter of making immediate profits, taught you a great deal in those earlier days of your career about the importance of sustained and sustainable long-term relationships. And this is, I think, I have no data on this, and please others jump in on this, but I'm not certain necessarily we in the UK have got this lesson totally on board about customer service.
Hard to answer in general. I think one of the big problems in the UK is that people who are at the top of a lot of companies haven't worked their way up through various different functions. And I think if you take Germany, that one of the things they've been very good at is taking young graduate engineers and then rotating them through things, and they'll go into the accounts department on costing and so on. And typically, an engineer understands a lot more about how the product is made and can put together a much more meaningful cost structure. It sounds terribly boring, but actually it can give you great opportunities. But on the sales side that you're talking about, actually going out and meeting customers, seeing what the competition is doing at customers, it's an incredibly important function. And the problem is that in the UK, too many of the people who do that sort of thing aren't in a position to implement what they learn from those trips. And if the boss is an accountant, as they too often are, then they're not necessarily attuned to that kind of thing. And I think if you had a situation where you had more senior people who had frontline customer experience, they would be much better at implementing that kind of thing. And when I was later on, when I was chairman of companies, I always made sure that I was able to get out on the road for a few days each week with ordinary salespeople, meeting customers, and it was a tremendously important part of my intelligence about what was going on and what the company needed to be doing.
Can you just tell the story that really drove that home to you about what happened at BBI that really illustrated this point to you?
I'm not quite sure which point you.
Oh, it's when somebody somebody needed an order in a hurry, and
right.
you.
We had a German customer who suddenly needed a delivery in a very short space of time, an unscheduled delivery. And it was pretty obvious that one of their German manufacturers had let them down, probably with a tool breakage or problem like that. And we pulled out all the stops. We got the delivery to them and stopped their production line from stopping. And what I easily could have done would have been to demand a blackmail price for that delivery. And frankly, we had them over a barrel, and I could have easily demanded a very high premium for a special delivery like that. But I said that we wouldn't even charge them the overtime costs and so on. We'd just deliver on perfectly normal terms if they would allow us to quote for their main requirements in the future, which they never had in the past. And they did. And we built it into a very big customer for us and a very good relationship.
Yeah, I think that is such a great story. Just to pick up on what you were saying about the way some of the other businesses work, you mention quite often how accountants running businesses tend to enjoy cost cutting as a way of achieving short-term profits and not building for growth. I mean, didn't you say once that somebody fired an entire sales force in order to save money?
Yes, yeah. Well, that was a crazy thing to do, obviously. I think one of the problems is cost cutting is one of the quickest ways of improving profit. So if you're under short-term profit pressure, if you want to set out to grow your business, you've got to do product development, you've got to do market development. It takes time, it costs money before it pays back. But cost cutting is very quick. I think another problem is in this country, we've too often done cost cutting by going around turning out the lights and not recruiting and trying to make people write on both sides of the writing paper and not replace the pencils and this sort of stuff. Whereas a good company like Siemens, when I was talking to them, that they would say, right, we can see strategically we've got to take 10% out of the cost of this product. How do we do it? And they look at the engineering of the product, they look at the manufacturing process, they decide they need new machine tools, robots, whatever it is. They invest in those things and take 10% of the cost out in a long-term and positive way.
Yeah, John Hardwick, did you have your hand up? Sorry, I couldn't work out whether you had.
Yeah, I did, Nick. I was actually just reflecting on something that Tom said a few minutes ago when he was talking about the experience in the Tyrol. And he's already mentioned the cultural side of, the class system in the UK. And related to that, I'd be interested in whether there's something about the language that we use, because Tom referred to an engineer in Germany. And I believe that in Germany, they have separate words for different types of engineers. And I always feel that it's a bit of a problem that in the UK, the guy who comes to fix your washing machine is an engineer, and the guy who is paid £250,000 a year for designing some huge mechanical or structural engineering is also an engineer. And is that part of the problem? Is it that we don't have the right language to describe what we're doing?
I think that the actual language is a symptom of the way the status that we hold these people in. That yes, you're absolutely right. In Germany, many of the senior people would be a doctor of engineering, DEng. In Italy, they're ingegneri, and so they have a title. In the UK, none at all. And I comment in my book that if you went to Oxford, the most senior degree you could get as an engineer is a Doctor of Philosophy. It doesn't mention engineering at all. There's no such thing. But yeah, I think it comes back to the status in which we hold manufacturing, which unfortunately is way below the way where we hold lawyers or accountants and so on.
Too true. Ram Shankar, good evening to you.
Good evening, everybody. Right, so I've been listening to the conversation until now, and John's comment about terminology, John Hardwick's comment about terminology suddenly triggered me into action, for lack of a better phrase. This terminology that you spoke about, John, is actually something I've actually faced with the organization whose label is behind your image, the Manufacturers Alliance. The problem is, this bad terminology is not just limited to what defines an engineer. It's also limited to what defines who a manufacturer is based on the alliance group. Everybody thinks unless you're making something, you're not a manufacturer. But what they fail to realize is the very definition of manufacturing has changed from making something or forging a piece of metal or casting a piece of metal to the entire product life cycle, right from the time you think about the product, how you design it, where the supply chain comes from, what happens to the product after it's used, whether you recommission it, decommission it, whatever you do. The entire ecosystem is manufacturing. And surprisingly enough, that group of people, the Manufacturers Alliance, either did not realize what it is, or they simply did not want to talk to a consultant like Equitas Engineering because they thought we are out there to maybe take their money and not offering any value. It felt like it was the blind leading the blind. So we as industry, we as sector, we as manufacturers out to first come together and change how we define our sector and what we do for a living. Unless we do it internally, unless the change comes from within, no matter what government does, no matter what anyone else does, no matter what the Germans do, we're still going to be stuck in a rut, for lack of a better phrase. Apologies for the rather blunt northern style usage of language.
I think
we maybe ought to have a sidebar conversation, Ram.
I think you're right that manufacturing is very poorly defined, and part of it is particularly changing technology, so that software is now a very significant part of a lot of manufactured products. But writing software code wouldn't usually be regarded as a manufacturing job. I think the other thing is that if you look at the government statistics on manufacturing, the Office of National Statistics and so on, manufacturing includes food manufacturing, food and drink. So that's the biggest single segment. And of course, it's got a completely different set of criteria from engineering or chemicals or furniture or anything like that. And the issues that food manufacturing companies and drink manufacturing companies face are extremely different. And particularly in recession, they tend to be far more resilient. So that in a recession, real manufacturing companies like engineering tend to suffer a very hard time. Food and drink has hardly changed. And so the consequence is it doesn't look as though the impact on manufacturing is as bad as it is. And I think when you look at the lobby groups, like say Make UK, originally that was the Engineering Employers Federation. And it was strictly engineering. Then they wanted to broaden their appeal, but I think it was a shame that they've embraced things like food and drink, because I think their whole business system is so completely different, and their constraints and objectives are so different.
I think that's a really interesting point. They also have the degree of automation in food and drink in some factories. I'm told in the United States, almost no people at all. Nearly everything is actually automated. And in the UK, I think there's an awful lot of quite low skilled in the workforce. It's not the same. It doesn't have the same skills imperatives that the engineering side of manufacturing, if you like. I thought it was rather telling that you used the phrase real manufacturing there, Tom. I think that whatever conversation Ram and John Hardwick have, I think that probably needs to be expanded. I think that's possibly a whole session in itself. What is manufacturing? Let's define it, because I'd love to hear some other views on that, because Ram's definition to me, given as I'm speaking as a journalistic observer who's intimately involved in a lot of stories around manufacturing, but I'm not in it. I love what Ram said. I think that absolutely does resonate with me, that manufacturing can and should be something. I mean, I also look at the way that Paul Stead, our design colleague who came on and presented about the importance of product design and commercialization, I would say that every bit as much part of the manufacturing cycle as somebody who's installing some machinery and casting metal or whatever. Anybody else got any thoughts? I see some people who I'd love to get some contributions from. But I don't like putting people on the spot, Stephen Barr. I don't think he heard me. Anyway, yes, he did. Yeah, please, I'd love to hear your observations on what we've been hearing, Stephen, because you've been so intimately involved in manufacturing at so many levels throughout the last few years, and particularly with the interface with government, having been at MAS.
Yeah, I need to start with an apology that intimacy is one step removed from actually being at the sharp end. So I'm always very jealous when I hear people like Tom who've got real in-depth experience. And Tom, I think particularly what I'm picking up is your experience across large and small companies. Since I've been prompted by Nick, let me ask the question about government support. Government doesn't officially support larger companies. It says it's very keen to support smaller companies, but isn't really doing it at the moment. I just wonder what your views would be about a perfect future for government and industry cooperation in the future. What kind of support would businesses actually want from government?
Well, my own view is that what we need from government is an economy and a society which is conducive for running engineering and manufacturing businesses in the broader context. I'm in my book, I've steered way away from saying we should have subsidies or we should have things like that. I really don't think those are the keys. And I think when you look at countries which have been very successful at manufacturing, they typically haven't done it that way. You might have some grants to get something going, but basically what you're looking for is a terrain where companies can get on and do their thing and operate effectively. And in the UK, I think one of the biggest problems to me is the city, the short-termism of the city, and all that goes with that, the whole private equity scene and so on. The government needs to regulate that a lot more. That's nothing specifically to do with engineering, but if they regulated that, then, in my view, there's some easy wins there that they could be going for. That one of the things I would like to see is something like the French Florange law, where with the way it works in France, if you've owned shares for 2 years, you get double voting rights, so that longer term shareholders have more influence on what happens than short term. You don't need to do it that way. You could do it. You could simply say the first 6 months you own shares, you don't have any voting rights at all. That would completely stop the games that hedge funds play. Another thing you could do is completely remove the tax deductibility of interest charges. That would screw the private equity companies who are exploiting pseudo debt as a way of taking money out of companies without paying corporation taxes. So there's some things they could be doing there very quickly and easily to rein in the city. Education is obviously one of the main things that a government is responsible for, and I think we have a very big problem in terms of training people for real jobs. Far too much of what's happening is people are leaving universities with degrees in media studies or something like that, and then finding there are no jobs for them. Meanwhile, if you look at a lot of engineering companies, they find it very difficult to recruit the skills they need. It seems extraordinary when you think that engineering has run down so much, but actually getting the skilled people you need is terribly difficult. And in Germany, Switzerland, about 40% of young people do apprenticeships, not all in manufacturing, maybe in retailing or other things. But the apprenticeship arrangements in this country have been lamentable. And the government changes a few years ago to introduce the apprentice training levy have been a disaster. So the education is something the government needs to be doing a lot about. And then energy policy is something which is, I think, tremendously important at the moment. The government's been very assertive in setting out goals that we're going to be carbon neutral by, I forget what the latest date is, but there's absolutely no roadmap of how the hell we're going to get there. If we're going to be doing things like switching from gas-fired boilers in domestic homes to hydrogen power or to heat pumps, what's it going to be? Who's going to build those? Where are we going to build them? We don't have an industry that does it. Who's going to produce the hydrogen? There's an awful lot of stuff there. And also, of course, very importantly, who's going to pay for all that? And I think the whole question of energy policy is crucial, but partly for the whole, obviously, the issue of global warming, but for manufacturing strategy, that we could be developing a whole lot of different activities here. And Boris likes to go on about green jobs and all the rest of it, but we need a plan. It's if you think of a company that says, okay, we're going to try to get 20 million pounds worth of exports to America by the end of next year, and then just doesn't do anything. It's just ridiculous. You've got to have a plan of how the hell you're going to get there. So what I'm looking for is government to take action in those particular fields. The city, education and energy, I'd say, are some of the absolutely key ones. I'm not looking for grants and support. Obviously, some of the things that's happening now, like the government seems very keen on innovation, and they're talking about putting money into things like battery technology and artificial intelligence. That could be a good thing. And if they have a consistent policy and stick with it, because we've had so many changes in policy before. We've had so many schemes which get started. There was a scheme for setting up more automotive supply chains, and then that all got stopped. There was the strategy that Greg Clark launched 3 or 4 years ago, and now that's all been torn up. And to get anywhere with batteries and artificial intelligence is going to take perseverance and a lot of cash. So the concept sounds good, but as I say, I'm not looking for handouts. I'm looking for a level playing field on which we can perform.
Thank you.
I think your point
Roy
about
Spencer.
terrain is important.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. That's actually a very good word, terrain. I prefer it to ecosystem, which is the other favorite word du jour. Roy Spencer, good evening to you.
Sorry. Well, I speak as a lapsed and unfrocked metallurgist who spent time in a drop forge in the hellhole that's Wednesbury, but I can still hear. And but the point I wanted to make is the government is capable of taking action when it really needs to. And I was interested to read the other day that the MOD have bought Sheffield Forge Masters. Now, the reason they bought it, of course, is that it's a very strategic industry. I think it's the only business that can make gun barrels in this country. That's one of the things that they do. So they can move if they really see the need, but there doesn't seem any consistency there. And the factory in Wales, chip manufacturer, it's all a bit too late when they actually come to action. To say, oh, well, maybe the Chinese shouldn't buy this. Maybe this isn't a good idea. So I come back to what's been said about them not really having a strategy. And how can you force the government to have a strategy? Well, we could paint some scenarios about the future. And I've been looking at this quite a lot recently, and I've been looking at a thing. I've got three vague scenarios: a pandemic world, warming world, and conflict world. And if you look at those and the potential that comes out of that, it all frequently comes back to supply chain, green economy, circular economy. It doesn't matter, and reshoring in some way, because we can't kid ourselves that these things aren't going to happen, because they are happening all the time, and in my conflict strategy, my concern is about China and Taiwan, as well as what's going on in the Middle East, and the vulnerability of the Suez Canal, which was brought up recently. So it's about having strategy, and I agree with what you said, Tom, about they don't seem to have a strategy. But if we can publish these scenarios and put a lot more visibility around those, maybe somebody will get scared enough, actually, to pick up on a couple of the ideas. Because when they actually get scared, they do something. And, I think we've just got to keep painting these pictures and telling these stories until actually they get some attention.
Well, you make some very interesting points. That I'm just reading Peter Ricketts' book, Hard Choices. I don't know if any of you have seen it. He was the British ambassador to France and was head of the Security Council in the UK defence arrangements and so on, worked with government at the highest level. And he says that he reckons Harold Macmillan was the last British Prime Minister who had a strategic view. And he says part of the problem is the media, and things have just got faster and faster, and nowadays with social media it's got worse and worse. So suddenly they've got hold of the fact that Boris's flat decoration wasn't paid for by him and what have you, and suddenly everybody's flared up about that. So Boris spends the next 3 days worrying about his flat decoration, and they don't think strategically. But I think the other point behind what you're saying is the whole question of lobbying. That the fact is, I don't think the manufacturing industry has been very successful at lobbying the British government at all. And I think if you look at how the hedge funds have done, the venture capital people have done, and now the building people have done. Now the news tonight is that something like a quarter of recent Tory party donations have come from building and people. And guess why they're getting their planning regulations relaxed, and why they're not being forced to insulate houses to the standards which will be required in a few years' time. It's quite crazy we're building houses now which are going to be obsolete very soon. But we've just not been very successful. I don't know how we do it better. I suspect part of the answer is money, and that we don't have enough funds going into places like Make UK. But I just don't know how effective they are otherwise. And I'm not an experienced lobbyist. America obviously is a place where there's a hell of a lot of lobbying goes on, and money speaks for a lot there. But I think as an industry, we have not been very good at getting governments here.
I think that's without doubt absolutely true. We've got about 8 minutes left. Niraj, good evening to you.
Hi, good evening, and Tom. Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to hear your views in this conversation. You mentioned about factors like need to invest in skills or in energy for the success of manufacturing. How about having the right technology in place? Because with due respect, I'm also an engineer, but engineering is not just about nuts and bolts. It's also about things like IT, having those systems, and with the automation increasingly coming into play, as Ram also touched on. Isn't it also equally important to have the right technology, the right platforms, the right mindset in place for success, and also agility to adapt to changing dynamics of a global market that are changing faster than ever before?
Certainly, I think our ability to react is probably relatively good, that we tend to be quite good at some of those things. In terms of technology, I think we're very dependent on other countries for a lot of the technology that we use and we need. Like robots, for example, that as far as I know, there isn't a single company in the UK that's making robots, apart from very specialist things for medical procedures and that kind of thing. Otherwise, you're really dependent on the Germans and the Japanese as the main sources of technology like that. I don't think that's necessarily a major problem. The problem is more that we haven't necessarily utilized those things as much as we should have done. And we probably don't have enough engineers who really know how to install and apply a robot, which isn't always easy. That Nick was talking before about low productivity in food industry, and as I say, that's a different thing. But yeah, I've been appalled at going around food factories at how they simply don't use modern production engineering at all. But it's available. It can be there if you need it, if you're willing to exploit it, and indeed if you've got the money to make those investments and the time to do it.
Thank you. 6 minutes left. Steve. Steve Murphy.
Just a quick question, Tom. To what extent, I don't know if you've done this, but to what extent have you maybe tried to not just act as an individual, but pull together senior like minds from industry to effectively try and influence the government? In other words, it's what's not clear to me from a manufacturing point of view, that we have senior people within manufacturing trying to influence the government. So have you tried to sort of gather together a group of like minds to put your point over?
It's an interesting question. It would be a daunting task. I don't know quite how I'd go about it. One of the problems is the biggest hitters, the most senior people, are running quoted companies. And for the most part, when you're running a quoted company, you just don't say some of the things that I say in my book. The city wouldn't tolerate it if you did. So I think it would be a great idea to try to do that. But I think it needs to be done through one of the industry groups like Make UK or something like that. But I don't see them really leveraging that. Most of what they seem to do seems to be at a much lower level than what you're talking about.
What about the CBI? Are they just too big and quoted companies?
I don't think the CBI is particularly interested in manufacturing. One of my ex-colleagues got on one of the fairly senior CBI committees, and they'd be debating some aspect of policy, and he'd say, well, that would be terribly difficult for manufacturing. And the other people at the table would look at him and say, so what? They were people from retailing and advertising, banking, what have you. But I don't have a great deal of respect for the CBI, and I'm not too sure that they handle the whole Brexit debate very well. And the new guy that they've now got running it, I certainly haven't taken a shine to myself. No, I think we need to be doing it through more specialist areas, and I think within manufacturing, Make UK is probably the leading lobby group at the moment. But as you know, as Nick has said, there's a whole range of others, and it's not a very coordinated approach right now.
Okay, last few minutes, Ewan, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just picking up actually on what's just been talked about, because a couple of weeks ago we had one of our sort of manufacturing colleagues on, Andrea Wilson, and she was talking, and I think has been sort of active on LinkedIn about having a minister for manufacturing. And I just wondered, given what you've just said, whether you thought that that sort of role and position would be a good starting point, and if so, I guess where you'd look to try and find somebody like that.
We've already got a minister for business, and they should be interested in manufacturing amongst other things. I think the problem is if you get a minister for manufacturing, then you should have a minister for retailing, a minister for banking, a minister for advertising, a minister for furniture and interior design. I don't know where you start. And yeah, I mean, if the government wanted to take a real interest and appoint somebody like that, if they could appoint somebody good, then perhaps that would be helpful. But I don't really see how it fits into the present sort of structure. And I don't think, you know, if you look at a place like Germany, I don't think they have a minister for manufacturing. It's just something that's very high on all the agendas of German politicians. The suggestion I made in the book is that it would be jolly useful to appoint more experienced industrialists to the House of Lords. At the moment, I think we've got more Church of England bishops in the House of Lords than we have experienced industrialists. In fact, as far as I know, the only one is Anthony Bamford. And like many in the House of Lords, he doesn't actually speak much. I think he hardly ever goes there. But if we had more people in that sort of category, that actually vetting stuff coming through from the Commons, that would be a potential way to go, which might be more effective. But I don't see any sign of that happening.
Well, I think you're making the perfect case for your own elevation to the House of Lords, Tom. I think we should.
That was not a party political broadcast.
I think this should very much form part of our campaign for the BHAG, which we have the big, hairy, audacious goal in our mission, which is all going to be tied up with the development of UK MFG Unite, of which, as I promised everybody, more in a few days' time, but all is going extremely well. Tom, I cannot thank you enough. That was absolutely wonderful. What a great hour. I've really enjoyed myself. Thank you very much for taking the time out. Thank you for writing the book. And Julian has been watching this closely. Who knows? Maybe there's, Julian runs Bite-Sized Books, so maybe there is a second book in the offing, Tom. I think that there's definitely something to be done there. Anyway, good night, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. And thank you, as always, for your contributions. I hope you're all having a great summer. Tom, thank you again. Really appreciate it. And all the very best to you. And which I will say.